Hello, everyone. I'm Daniel Lewin, CEO of the Computer History Museum. I hope everyone is well and safe. Today, I'm pleased to welcome you to our virtual event with Twilio CEO Jeff Lawson and Lean startup author Eric Ries. They'll explore how to tap the often unappreciated innovative power of software developers to help companies succeed. Our programs are made possible through the generosity of our members and donors. And today we need your support more than ever to sustain the museum and delivering on our mission, which is to decode technology for everyone. Its computing past, digital present, and its future impact on humanity. Here today to introduce today's program and speakers is Marguerite Gong Hancock, who's the museum's VP of Innovation. Marguerite?
Thanks so much, Daniel. From banking and retail to insurance and finance, every industry is turning digital and every company needs powerful software. Companies have to get this right to survive, but what sets apart the companies that are succeeding in this transformation? And as technology citizens, how can we decode the evolving role of software and developers for innovation? Jeff Lawson's longtime software developer and founder of Twilio, a cloud communications platform company with a $55 billion market cap. In a new book that will be released next week, he lays out that developers are sought after, highly paid, and critical to compete in the digital economy. Yet many companies treat them like digital factory workers without fully understanding how to unleash their full potential. He argues, as Daniel said, that software developers are the creative workforce who can solve major business problems and drive change. So for today's program, Jeff will talk with Lean startup author Eric Ries about the mindset Jeff has coined, Ask Your Developer, a philosophy that he believes is the secret to driving innovation within businesses. Eric and Jeff will discuss questions including, in the rapidly evolving digital economy, what is misunderstood about software developers as a part of the innovation workforce? And what do business people get wrong? What can we learn from the best examples of company leaders who are finding effective ways to unleash the creativity of developers? And how can software developers live up to their potential as creative professionals and get a strategic seat at the table? Now, as is our tradition here at CHM, I'll introduce our speakers with 5 numbers. Jeff Lawson, he is co-founder and CEO of Twilio. 20 megahertz the speed of his first PC. 3, the number of companies founded before Twilio. 0, the number of dollars raised before his first attempt to raise money for Twilio. And 2, consumer electronics stores that he's banned from, Best Buy and Fry's. 1% of equity that Twilio has committed to corporate philanthropy. Welcome, Jeff. Now, Eric Ries, he is the founder and CEO of Long-Term Stock Exchange. He created the Lean Startup methodology and is the author of the Lean Startup and the Startup Way. Millions of copies sold of the Lean Startup and the Startup Way. $1 trillion the size of the problem and capital markets that he's working on. 50 years since the new listing venue was launched. Thousands of entrepreneurs supported, and 2 kids under age 7. Jeff and Eric, we're thrilled to feature you today for our CHM Live program. We look forward to your conversation. Take it away, Eric.
Hello, welcome, and thank you so much for having us. Jeff, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Well, I want to say a special thanks to the Computer History Museum for having us for this event. It's a special place, and I wish we could be doing this in person. I've been to many incredible events there, and I remember just to give one reflection, I gave a talk there on the day that it was reported that Steve Jobs had passed away. And it was just an incredibly meaningful thing to be contemplating the legacy of the technology industry and seeing it in person, sharing it in community was a really special occurrence, even though I gotta say, that feels like 2 lifetimes ago now, both for all of our lives and in the history of the technology industry, things feel so different since that time. So thanks very much for having us. And it's an especial pleasure for me to get to interview Jeff, who I've known for a long time and greatly admire as a technologist, as a startup founder, and really increasingly as a civic leader here in San Francisco. So Jeff, thanks for giving me the chance to do this.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate you. I feel like I've interviewed you a number of times, and now we get to swap roles. But it's great to be here.
Turnabout is fair play. Well, I thought for everybody listening, the most important thing to start with is you have written a book and are about to join the ranks of published authors, if I remember correctly, a book to be published on January 12th. So you're already had an accomplished career building technology. You have built one of the most iconic and successful companies of this new generation in technology. Yet you felt compelled to also take on the not always rewarding and challenging process of writing a book. So why?
I don't know, Eric, you make it look pretty easy. It's interesting. I have my background is I'm a software developer and now the CEO of a company and now a public company. And so I have one foot in both the worlds of writing code and being a software developer and the technical process of innovating and building and maintaining software. But also my other foot is in the world of being a business executive. And what I often find is that there's a big gap between those two different sides of the table. Business executives don't really know how software is built, don't really know what developers do every day, and how all this digital transformation actually happens when hands are on a keyboard. And likewise, developers don't fully understand the things that business executives are thinking about, and you get the Dilbert pointy hair boss type conversations. And so what I sought to do in writing this book was to really build a bridge between the world of the business executives and the world of developers. And it comes from the fact, two facts really. One is I've had this conversation with so many business leaders throughout the years of building Twilio. And we're a company with 200,000 customers. And as you can imagine, that kind of runs the gamut of nearly every kind of company you can imagine, from your Silicon Valley startups all the way to your Fortune 50 companies who are undergoing their own transformations and having to go from a 100-year-old manufacturing concern or whatever and to become a software company, because every company really is undergoing that transformation and has to get good at building software. And as they do, understanding how are you going to attract developer talent? How are you going to motivate that developer talent? And how do you build a world-class engineering culture, like the companies that people typically think of in that realm, Google, Facebook, Amazon, et cetera? Because if you want to compete with those digital companies, as nearly every company in every industry finds they need to,
whether you want to or not, really.
Yeah, right. You need to be able to act like them, and you need to be agile, and you need to unleash a lot of innovation. And a lot of the systems that those companies have built up aren't really geared towards that. But in particular, what I found is that a lot of executives understand the need for digital transformation. And, like they heard Mark Andreessen 15 years ago, software is eating the world. But nobody has really talked enough about the people who make digital transformation happen. The software developers, the people actually building, and the people who are able to unleash a lot of that ability for a company to transform, to excel at digital initiatives. And so little has been said about how do you actually unleash that talent? How do you work with developers? And how do developers work? And so that was the main idea behind building or writing the book, is to try to build a parlance and a system for helping executives, business-minded folks really understand what developers do, how they do their jobs, and how understanding that can really unleash the ability for those business executives to work together, to partner with that technical talent to actually achieve success in the digital era.
Well, I really enjoyed the book and, of course, wrote the foreword, so really liked it.
I really enjoyed the foreword, so,
Yeah, exactly. So it's a mutual admiration society here. But the thing that I want to get into the meat of the book, because I think the philosophy that you espouse is really important for business leaders, especially to hear, and for technologists to understand that perspective too. But I got to say that part of the book that I enjoyed the most was when you actually shared a little bit about your own personal background, how you discovered technology, the scenes in the book of you like discovering the power of making things with your father. I found, it really resonated for me. So maybe talk a little bit before we get into the business stuff. Talk about your personal experience. How did you come to be a software developer and eventually the founder of Twilio? And how do you feel like those experiences have influenced you?
It's interesting. I kind of got the bug to build when I was a little kid, maybe, 7 years old, because my dad was a radiologist and he'd bring home these boxes full of cardboard because they used cardboard to package the X-ray films at the hospital he was at. And we would do these projects and, I'd say things like, "Oh, Dad, can we make a VCR?" And he'd be like, "Sure." And we'd take a cardboard box and we'd draw the buttons on it and we'd draw the slot and all that stuff. And then at the end of it, I'd say, "Great, now can we make it really work?" And my dad would be like, no, it's a piece of cardboard with marker drawings for buttons. Like, it's not going to really work. We'd have to be a multinational corporation within a factory somewhere to make a VCR that really works. So all I could do was make these like poor facsimiles of the things in the real world. And then along came, the computer, and I got my first PC. I had Apple IIe in the early days, and then my first PC I got in, I think, 1990, a 386DX, 20 megahertz, really pimped out machine, and started to realize that you could write programs for these things. And suddenly you could make a machine really work. And I thought that was so exciting. But of course, in the early days, you could write a program on your Apple IIe that, did something neat to show off to your parents, but, that was about it. And then came around the internet. And suddenly when you wrote software, you can have an audience of millions and now billions of people for that software you write. And to me, that is what unleashes this incredible creative energy of software developers and software builders, because not only can you make a machine do just about anything you want, you can also, if you build the right thing, have billions of people actually become your customers and use and impact their lives with what you built. And I saw that happen. I co-founded 3 companies before Twilio. 2 you've never heard of. One of them was StubHub, the online ticketing exchange. And the core thread among all 3 of those companies was that we were using the power of software to really iterate and build a great product and a great customer experience, because we were using the power of software, because we could write something, put it out in front of those customers, get their feedback, and iterate and push updates out daily. In order to make the product and that customer experience better. And I always love that. That's why software wins, is because we can iterate so quickly. But the other experience I had at all 3 of those companies was we needed communications to actually bridge the last mile between all the software we were writing and actually touching a customer, alerting them to something or letting them contact us. And I always had these ideas for like, wouldn't it be neat if a customer could call us, or we could text them when these things happen. And every time we had these ideas, we said, that would be amazing, except I'm a software developer. Like, making a phone ring is magical. I have no idea how to go about doing that. And we call the companies that seem like they did know how to do that. We call, like Cisco, or we call carriers and say, hey, we have this idea. How do we build it? And they'd say, hey, we can help you with that. The first thing is you're going to roll out a bunch of copper wire from a carrier to your data center. Then you're going to rack up a bunch of hardware, like telco, PBX type stuff. And then you're going to buy a software stack and plop it on top. And then none of that stuff actually works together out of the box, nor does it do what you want it to do. So you're going to bring in an army of, professional services people to come and hammer the thing into submission. And, but we think we can get it to work. It'll be 2 years and $3 million. Sign here, we'll get started. And I was always like, are you serious? Like, that's the antithesis of the software mindset. It's like waterfall, like literally, like, you have an idea, you spec it out, the vendor spends 2 years and millions of dollars, and then they give it to you and it's done.
And it always works every time. First right.
Yeah, right. It's a great history of success in that world. And I always thought that was just nuts, that we would spend millions of dollars and years before a customer ever touched it. And then of course, once they did, they tell us what we should have actually built. And then you embark on V2, which is another years and millions of dollars, right? And so we never did these projects, obviously, because it just seemed insane to me. And so we, after realizing I had that experience at 3 companies in a row, I said, seems like communications needs to be a first-class citizen in the world of software. Mm-hmm. And that if other developers are like me, they too have these use cases for communications and the products they're building, and they've probably just said, oh, well, that's not what I do. And they moved on and they didn't actually build those things that they wanted to build. And so we started Twilio to solve that problem of bringing communications into the realm of software developers, so that when you're building a customer experience, like for a company end to end, and there's all these different touch points that typically developers and companies are interested in building to make it a great experience, now communications can be a key part of those endeavors. And to me, it's always been about, what can I build that really works? Going back to the days of the cardboard VCR, what can I build that really works, that humanity, my customers are going to enjoy, and that will move the needle forward for like my business or whatever my goals are? And when communications and more broadly speaking, customer engagement was missing from the toolbox of the world's software developers, we took the opportunity to go put it in the toolbox.
So I like that full circle aspect of this. And I want to pick out something that you said that I think is really interesting. So you're talking about having those conversations with carriers and stuff. And you said, obviously, we're not going to build this thing in the waterfall way because it's obviously not going to work. And for all the reasons you outlined, it's going to take far too long before we get any feedback. It's going to be too expensive. But when you said the word obviously, that really struck me, that is the way that someone who has been building software for a while and has to kind of put that mindset deep into them would react to that. But I can tell you, I have met many business executives over the years who have not found this insight to be obvious. And so give us a little more history. Like, what was the first piece of software, do you remember, that you ever wrote that had actual customers or had some kind of third party, some person other than yourself try to use it? Like, help us understand, like, just give us a little more of the atmosphere. What did you first learn computer programming on? Who taught it to you? And who was your first customer, if you can remember?
Well, how did I get started writing software? Like the very first, I'll tell you a nutty story. I'm a big believer that to force yourself to learn something, like the best way to do it is just to commit to some project. And even if you're scared and you don't know how you're going to accomplish it, the way to force yourself to learn something is just to say, I'm going to do it. And what better way than to tell a customer or something like that you're going to do it. And so when I was a sophomore in college, I'd taken a year or 2 years of computer science classes, and you're writing sort algorithms, the same bubble sort that has been written millions of times before, you're writing it yet again. And I didn't find that to be particularly fulfilling to just, there's no discovery here. We all know it can be written. It's just the question is, can I figure it out? But I really wanted to write stuff that people were going to use. And a friend of mine, his dad ran a small software company. It was very small. It was 2 or 3 people in the Detroit area, which is where I grew up. And they made desktop software for Windows computers that talked to these industrial printers. Like the kinds of printers that cost millions of dollars are in the basement of large corporate headquarters when you need to print thousands of copies of some big bound thing. And they wrote desktop software to interface with those printers so that people around the company could submit print jobs. And it was 1996, I want to say, and the web was coming along, and his customers started asking him, hey, can we get a web version of this thing? And he didn't know anything about the web. And his son said, oh, you should talk to Jeff. He's a developer. So I go into the guy's office. His name was Phil. I still remember Philip. And I go into his small office in a small office park in suburban Detroit, and he explains what he needs. And he's like, okay, I need a web interface. And I write down my notes, like a web interface. And it needs to have a SQL backend. And I wrote, okay, SQL. And I wrote SEEQIL ? Okay, great. What else? And he Netscape enterprise server, JavaScript on the server. It all started there. And I wrote all his notes. I said, okay, fantastic. I will come back to you with a proposal. And I went home and I literally just researched, okay, what is this SQL thing he talked about? What is Netscape enterprise server? What is JavaScript? And I built this thing for him that I think it worked. I think he deployed it. But that was the first time I ever wrote software that was really used by anybody. And it was just because I just committed myself, I want to build something that someone's going to use. And I convinced him to trust me to build it somehow magically. And then just set my mind to it. I remember back then, you didn't really Google things. You just bought a book. I went to, Barnes and Noble and bought a book about SQL and web development and all this kind of stuff. And that was how I taught myself really to make real world software, was by having my first customer.
That story is so common among those of us who chose technology entrepreneurship as a path early in our lives. I have exactly those same stories of telling people that you certainly definitely can do something, and then 5 minutes later having to go look up what it is that you've just committed to do to find out whether it's even possible. And I think there's something about that mindset that, of course, we should acknowledge that privilege plays a huge role in this story, because of course, having someone trust you at a young age without necessarily the credentials to merit it is not an opportunity available to everybody. But it's also about a mindset that you believed that you could learn anything in technology that would be necessary in order to be able to deliver. And I wonder if you have thoughts about, where did you get that kind of learning mentality, learning mindset, that confidence in your own ability to learn and improve, given how much I know that's played such a big role in what happened later in your career?
One of the stories I noted in the book, which was I got my first, Windows 3.0 computer or whatever in 1990. And I had no idea what I was doing, but I would just dive into the to the bowels of it and just try to figure stuff out. And back in those days, it was AutoExec and command.com. It was like the core of like teaching it to boot up. And whenever you bought some new thing, needed drivers, you had to go monkey with those files. And I would regularly just screw up the computer. Like it wouldn't boot anymore. And you'd be like, oh. And so I had an uncle, an aunt and uncle who lived around the block from me. And I would go to my uncle's house and he had a PC. And I would say, hey, can I copy your AutoExec bat? Because I screwed mine up.
I remember that, yeah.
And put it on a floppy, come back, copy his, try to restore mine. And after doing that enough times, you just kind of learn that you get in there, and even if you screw something up, it's fixable. And you don't have to fear the computer. You don't have to fear building because it's a continual learning process, and anything is fixable for the most part. And so it kind of takes the edge off of experimenting, and takes the edge off of like, well, what if I make a mistake? Oh, well, you made a mistake. Then what? You can fix it and keep going forward. And so I think that experience in some ways as a child, just starting with computers, taught me that like, this wasn't a machine to be feared. It wasn't a delicate, precious object. Rather, it was what we made of it. Mm-hmm. And so getting your hands dirty, diving in there was just something you could do. And I always really relished that idea. And I think it really started with that.
Imagination made tangible. If we have any listeners who have not ever had the joy of getting to do what we're describing, maybe you had a background, in a non-technical field or in business, you really should try it. It's a rush like no other. We're already getting pretty awesome audience Q&A coming in, so please do keep those questions coming. I'll try to work some of them in as we go. And one of them I think is a critical question that must be addressed before we can get on to more serious topics and of course I think I can infer what the answer is, but I think an audience member needs to know why you were banned from 2 computer stores.
I'm trying to decide if I should be in the sunlight zone or the shade zone here. I got the sun is moving and it's shifting on me right now. Okay, so
pandemic problems.
One instance where they were wrong and one instance where I was wrong. I was starting a bricks and mortar retailer was my third company. We were extreme sporting goods, so skateboarding, snowboarding, surfing. A bricks and mortar retailer in Los Angeles, and as you might imagine, I was not the extreme sports person. I was the technology person. And so we're opening our first store, and I have a long checklist of all the things I need to get set up for the store to be able to open. And I'm on like zero budget basically, because it's a startup. And one of the last things I realized that I had to do was to hang phones on the walls. So like members, you go into a retail store. Remember when we used to do that? And there's like phones for all the departments. So if they need to call each other or taking customer calls or whatever.
Sure. Yeah. I remember seeing that in historical drama somewhere.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So I needed phones for the walls, and like right around the block from our store we were in the finishing stages of construction, was a Best Buy. And it was literally it was like the morning we were opening the store, like the grand opening. I'm like, oh, phones, I need phones. So I go into Best Buy and I load my cart up with like 12 phones and I go to the checkout. And these were like just like the very basic, like, 12 buttons and that's about it, phones at full price. And I get to the checkout and the guy at the cashier says, I'm sorry, you can't buy 12 phones. And I said, well, why not? He says, limit 2. It doesn't say that anywhere. I'm like, I'm paying full price. They're not on sale. And like, and he's like, I need these. And he's like, I'm sorry, you can't do it. So I bought 2 and then I went back to the store where we had all these construction people and our employees and everybody's getting the store ready. I'm like, I need 5 volunteers to come with me. I brought 5 people into Best Buy, each of them with 2 phones. And I was like standing in the parking lot. I'm like, I need you to go in, get this phone, check out. And I'm looking through the window and I see the cashier talking to the people, and then kind of like, there's a commotion a little bit. And the guy points out the window at me in the parking lot. And I'm like, oh, come on. And I walk in. I'm like, what's the problem? He's like, I can tell you're just getting these people. I'm like, you said limit 2. This is the deal. And he's just like yelling at me. And I'm like, what's the issue? Like, what do you think I'm going to do with these? I think you're going to sell them on the internet. I'm like, well, that would be a horrible business model for me to buy them at full retail price from you and to sell the 12 phones. And like, so he's like, you're kicked out. He's like, you can't come in here anymore. So that was my Best Buy. And then my Fries story is that was my fault. So we were doing a big promotion. We were live streaming a skateboarding event from our parking lot. And we have these famous like skateboarders doing this event, and we were going to live stream. And this is like 2004 when live streaming on the internet was really hard. And I like got this whole setup, very fragile, to figure out how to live stream it. But I needed there were like a few supplies that I needed. And I stayed up, like I pulled all-nighters for like 3 nights to figure out the logistics of getting this whole thing. Like I built it all myself. but I needed like a giant cord to like stretch out to the parking lot and a bunch of things like that. So I go to Fry's, and I've been awake for like 3 days. And I get the shopping cart and I bring it there, and I've got my corporate credit card, which had my co-founder's name on it. And I hand it to the cashier, and they're like, I need to see your ID. I hand them my ID. Doesn't match. I'm like, oh, it's my corporate card. I'm a co-founder. It doesn't matter. We won't do it. I'm like, oh, and by the way, at this point in my career, we've been running the startup, taking no salary for like 2 years. So I'm like maxed out credit cards. Like I'm that entrepreneur. And I give him like one credit card with my name on it, and it's like declined. I'm like, oh, and I gave him my like another card, and it's an Amex. Like we don't take Amex. And I'm like, oh, and it's a disaster. Finally, I get some card to go through, and they give me the receipt to sign, and I sign it, F you, hand it back, and the cashier looks at it and says, manager. Manager comes over, looks at it. They take all the stuff. They're like, we're not letting you have this. You're banned from our store. Get out, never come back again. So that one was I was not being a good person.
The quality of work we do after 3 all-nighters.
Exactly.
Although it's interesting that you're telling the stories now, they're all communication stories, which I don't think I'd ever pieced together before. And so it's interesting to me that your story, whereas a lot of us who came up as developers, the story is about the technology and what it can do. I mean, I remember writing Tetris for the TI-82 graphing calculator, bored in math class one day and putting that on the internet. But your stories are about communication and about live streaming and about telephones and about the need for people to talk to each other. I think that's so unusual for technologists. And of course, it's why you've had this incredible success building a communications company. Why do you think communications is a theme in your life? Where does that come from?
That's an interesting question. I'd never noticed that both of those stories happen to be about communications, but you're right. I do think that part of creating experiences involve this sort of two-way engagement where like, look, we can see words on a screen, but there's so many other ways where we actually connect with people. And that usually involves something more than just like a web page with some text on it. And I think that like for developers out there, web developers out there, if you've been doing the job for long enough, you realize that like most of what developers do is like building CRUD web applications, like forms that store into a database, that pull the back out of the database and maybe report it out somewhere at some point. And after a while, you get kind of bored. You're like, is this all computers can do? And is this all humanity needs from computers? And you really get this itch to like, no, I want to do something that's just more immersive, more impressive, more viscerally connective than just like CRUD applications on the internet. And I feel like I've always been drawn to those kinds of things. Like at the retailer, I wrote my own point of sale system. This was about 2004, 2005. It was written in PHP. It was a single page web application that I wrote in 2005 in PHP. That was a full point of sale system. And the thing that I loved about it was, I got to write in PHP, mind you, the drivers for like how to make the cash drawer pop open or how to interface with the debit card reader so you could swipe a card and like enter your PIN and do all that. The laser guns to like scan the tags on the merchandise. Like to me, when you can make the code jump out of the screen and actually do something in the real world, that was the most exciting part of writing software, because you weren't just arranging things in a database, but you were actually doing something in the real world that affected people's lives and their jobs. And I've always been drawn to those moments of computing and what we can build as developers, because quite frankly, those were just the most exciting. That's where computers got really real to me. And then along comes mobile, and you can imagine the universe of things you could do just explodes in that category. And that's what I find so exciting about the current era of computing.
So let's talk a little bit about the Ask Your Developer, build or die approach. Maybe say a little bit about why you decided to call the book Ask Your Developer instead of just, developer knows best or development is awesome. Just talk a little bit about the origin of that. And, we're now, if you think about kind of zoom out the history of management and, the eras of management thinking, going back to Fred Taylor or the Alfred Sloan revolution or lean manufacturing, and people have, are used to thinking about kind of information work, knowledge work, information technology as an era of management thinking. But we've now been in the technology industry long enough for there to even be a history of thinking within the technology industry. So how do you situate this idea, as something new? How does it relate to the history, and how is it different from how you were taught to think about technology and business when you were coming up in your career?
Well, what I observe is that so many companies really treat developers like digital factory workers. And what I mean by that is the idea is that there's business people and they're there to decide like what the business decisions are going to be, what software we should build, how it should work. And they write these specifications, like product requirements docs, PRDs, and they get thrown over the wall to developers whose job it is to take those specifications and write and turn them into code. And so people acknowledge that developers are these creative problem solvers that are able to take a spec handed to them and turn it into code. And that's the problem solving that they're able to do. Mm-hmm. And when you do that, you really limit the developer's ability to apply that creative problem solving mind to anything but, okay, should this be a for loop or a while loop? And you're like, well, these are really trivial decisions in the grand scheme of business, when in fact, there are so many really hard problems that companies need to solve in this era. And so what my mantra has been, don't hand developers problems, or don't hand them solutions, hand them problems. Because when you hand a developer a solution, they will dutifully build that solution for you. But if you hand them problems, business problems, hey, we're trying to solve this thing. We're trying to improve the experience for our customer. We're trying to increase the profitability of our company. We're trying to crack into a new market. Now you can unlock the full creative problem solving ability of those developers to apply technology, which presumably they know pretty well. They know what the technology is capable of, and apply it to a business problem and come up with very different solutions. And it manifests in a few ways. I think that, a lot of executives kind of don't know that much about software developers. And they just assume like, oh yeah, it's like a black box that you put specifications and Mountain Dew into one side of, and out the other side, you get code. And like, that's how they think of developers. And how I think of developers is as creative problem solvers, because that's the essence of writing code, but it can be applied to so many other domains. And so I think about like compare two worlds, like one where you say, hey, developer, I need a form and it's got like the field says first name and it can be 40 characters long. That's one world. That's a world a lot of developers live in. And another world where the business executive says, hey, we're trying to reduce friction on sign up so that we can make it so customers can be successful in our product, not in 10 minutes like they are now, but how about 30 seconds? Now you unlock a lot of other ways to think about how one might go about solving that problem. The other thing that I find where this manifests is, executives often get really frustrated at software development because software development actually doesn't provide all the answers that executives feel like they want. I'll give you an example. Software developers will often say, well, I can tell you what product we're going to ship, what features it's going to have, but I can't tell you when we're going to ship it. Or they'll tell you, I can hit a launch date, but I can't tell you what features it's going to have. Or in reality, they'd say, well, I can tell you what features we're going to have and when we're going to ship it, but I can't tell you what quality it's going to be. And so it turns out that there's these hard trade-offs in software engineering that we like to pretend don't exist. And so when software developers are honest and they tell, the other side, like, I can't tell you what it's going to ship, like, it's infuriating. And I can tell you from personal experience, even though I'm a software developer, when I hear those answers as a business executive, you're like, oh, come on, we've got our big user conference. We have to ship it. We have to know what it has. Like, sorry, that's what it is. And so, or another one, right? Think about executives. Like, what's the tool that we have at our avail is budget. Like, that's in many ways, dollars is the control mechanism that executives have. And so when a project is running behind, what's the instinct of an executive? Oh, I'll just throw more money at it and we'll get it caught up. When in reality, we know that will often slow down the project, not speed it up. Because you throw it in, now the team has to do a bunch of hiring. They have to bring up up to speed a bunch of new developers and how the code works. And in fact, when the project is already running late, typically throwing more people at it will just make it later. And these are counterintuitive and somewhat infuriating. And so what I was trying to do is to show executives like, so first of all, here's how software development works. And here's why you get these counterintuitive answers that are pretty infuriating. Oh, but by the way, if you ask a developer, not tell a developer, you may be pleasantly surprised. I'll give you an example. I talked to one developer in the book, Chad, and he put it really nicely. He said that if you tell a developer with a specification, it must be like this, 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 and this. then the developer says, okay. And they look at the current code and they look at the current architecture and they say, well, in order to do the things that the specification says it must do, it's going to take 12 months. But if you say to the developer, here's what we're trying to accomplish, come up with the best solution, they might say, oh, well, given the architecture and the current code, I can do this. And there's a much shorter path to get there and achieve our goals. And they could come back and say, yeah, that's a 2-week project. So if you give developers the latitude to figure out, to answer the problem, not just implement the solution, you may actually get, everybody can get what they want, which is the executives getting, better software done faster, as opposed to meeting a specification that may or may not be the best way to solve the problem because you're ignoring all the knowledge that developers have about the existing system, the limitations of the technology, et cetera. And that's the other way in which asking your developer instead of telling your developer can net the things that the business executives want if they're open to that idea that developers are creative problem solvers and that creative problem solving can be brought to bear on business problems, not just the implementation of code.
I've seen that so many times, where there's some extraneous detail in a specification document that the business person doesn't even view as especially important, but they just threw it in there because for completeness sake. And, like the corners should be rounded corners. They happen to draw it with a rounded corner diagram. And the engineer comes back and says, it's going to take 2 years to build this. And they don't bother to mention it's because of the rounded corners that's going to require some whole new rewrite of the system from ground up. So that's really true. And and on the one hand, for those that, I'm sure a lot of people who are listening right now are like banging their head against their table, being like, yeah, this is giving me PTSD just from listening to this story of this negotiation that we have to have over and over again. And at some level, it speaks to the relative immaturity of the software industry because, the folks in manufacturing had to work out these same issues 100 years ago. And it took them several decades to do so. To realize that, hey, even factory workers should be treated as creative problem solvers, and that over-specifying how a job is to be done can lead to all kinds of problems. But there is an important difference, which is that the laws of physics don't really apply to software in the same way as to anything that we're doing in the real world. And so in manufacturing, there are these moments sometimes where you figure out a genuinely better way to do something and it makes something faster, better than you could do it before. But the order of magnitude of change tends to be pretty incremental, and it requires piling up a lot of incremental improvements over decades, like a company like Toyota has, to get dramatic improvements. But in software development, because it's imagination made tangible, every once in a while we come up with these solutions that are beyond Pareto optimal. We're talking about getting 80% of the benefit at 20% of the cost, sometimes 800% of the benefit at 2% of the cost. And I know you have studied Jeff Bezos and know him, but he has this concept that in baseball your batting average can be low, but at best you can only hit a home run. But when we're taking risks, when we're building software, we have these opportunities where we get to hit 1,000-run homer, and so our willingness to swing and our willingness to take risks should be proportionally higher. And I think that's an interesting combination of a truth about software development that people don't generally understand. It has these breakthrough ideas unconstrained by the laws of physics, and also an interesting idea about entrepreneurship and risk-taking and business that people don't understand. So maybe tell us some stories or some examples of times that you've seen that kind of asymmetric payoff from really treating software not as a black box, but in this new collaborative way that you've been describing.
Well, and it's so true. I tell the story of the Wright brothers, in creating the first manned-powered flying machine, right? And they when they designed it in their bicycle shop, and they took it out to Kitty Hawk, and they got in and they flew the thing, and it didn't work, and it crashed, and they took all these measurements and they fixed it as best they could. They tried again, and they would keep iterating on this idea, keep experimenting with their designs. And this is in an era where they had to get into their flying contraption and launch it in the air. And when it crashed, they broke bones. They nearly died multiple times. And I think about, like, if they were able to experiment and iterate so much on their idea, knowing that life and limb, like every fiber of their being, must have been saying, do not get back into that machine. It is going to kill you. If they could do it, so can we, because all we're doing is arranging magnetic particles on hard drives. And so that the idea that experimentation is the prerequisite to innovation is so important. And so the faster you can experiment. And the way to do it is by sharing problems. And so I go back to my sharing problems, and I'll give you an example from Twilio's history that I talk about in the book. There was this moment in Twilio's history very early on when, phone number porting, which is something that we do. Someone comes to Twilio, they want to port a phone number. There's a whole workflow and a process to do that. And it was like a very manual, there were spreadsheets involved. It was like an intern whose job was to do it. Well, it turns out we had gotten very behind in this. And the intern was really embarrassed and didn't tell anyone. And so we were getting all these angry customer emails. What's going on? My port's taking forever. And when we inspected it, we found the intern was like, he actually was like, oh, he started crying. Like, yeah, he was like the I Love Lucy, where she's hiding the bonbons in her shirt. Like, that's what was going on at Twilio. I was like, okay, we need to fix this ASAP. And so I grabbed we had one operations person in the company, and she knew how porting worked. And I grabbed one of the engineers, and I said, we need a solution. We need to automate this with software, and we need it done like yesterday. And so the way that she approached this was so brilliant, because she took the engineer and she said, okay, I'm going to show you how porting works. And she'd log into these horrible websites of like carrier backends and like how to submit these ports. And it was like, just the most atrocious software you can imagine, and explained how the whole process worked. Then she had him do the job for like, a dozen ports. So he actually did these really manual processes, right? And then after that, they said, okay, we need to design a system that actually does this automatically, because it's a workflow like anything else. And so with the knowledge of like how this thing worked, he was able to then start building that system. And in 2 weeks, they completely built this system. Now, if you had gone to them and said, okay, we need to write specifications, we need to write docs, blah, 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 blah. First of all, the engineer would have had no idea what they were building. So they would have had no clue how it's supposed to work. But second of all, it would have been like one of these things where the engineer gets the spec and like, okay, and then it would have taken 2 weeks just to give the estimate for how long it's going to take to build. As opposed to, okay, I understand it, let's just start iteratively building this thing up. And so I always—
some organizations 2 weeks just to schedule the meeting to discuss it.
Yeah, right. And so this idea of sharing the problem, and the developer got really like interested in this problem. Like, oh, this is a really cool, oh yeah, I got to automate these horrible systems out of the way so I can like actually create this great customer experience on the other side. And he got really into it. I remember this one moment where there was a, he told the story of they needed to add a field, like a notes field, to one part of the process. And he, having done the process, intrinsically understood, oh yeah, notes field would be very useful there. And what did he do? He added like an HTML, text box, text area, and then he added a database column, varchar 2000, wired them up, and it was done in like 5 minutes. And I was imagining what that process would look like in a normal, normally it'd be like, oh, we need to add a notes field. Okay, product manager writes a specifications document, hands it over, it goes back, he didn't say how long it is, blah, 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 and that would be like a month-long project. As opposed to he did it in 5 minutes. Because we all know as developers that most of these things that we do aren't that hard. Like, yes, there are people who are at the vanguard of computer science and machine learning and all this kind of stuff where it's really hard and might fail, it might never work. But like 99% of what people do in technology is like adding that notes field. And those things should be made easy. Those things should be made fast. And our users win and our companies win when we figure out how to do that.
Okay, it's time to start talking about excuses, because I can just hear in people's minds right now all of the things they're telling themselves about why this doesn't really apply to them. And I'm looking in the questions, and I'm not going to name any names here, but I see some folks with the same issue. And I'm going to name a few excuses, and I'll see how you would address them. The first one is, well, sure, this would work for you because you're special. You're a developer, you know how to speak their language, they trust you, got it. Or maybe it's because you're the founder and you have the moral authority to just pull someone on a project and tell them to do that. Or you're better at hiring developers than we are because you are a developer, and therefore your developers are really magically not ornery and difficult that like mine are. Or no, it's because you're a Silicon Valley company, and in Silicon Valley, because of something in the water, I guess, or the sunshine, we have certain special attributes that make it possible. I mean, you see where this is going? Like, there's so many ways in which people say, does this really apply to me? Do I need to pay attention to this? So talk about that. Like, how much of this do you think is—
Let me share with you a story that's about as far from like—
tell us the story about something totally
that you can imagine. Domino's Pizza.
Yes.
So Domino's Pizza is this crazy sleeper success story of the last decade. Their stock, since like 2011, I think they went public again in 2011, their stock like outperformed Facebook and Google and Amazon and and nobody knows about this story. It is nuts. And it really started when the CEO of Domino's, Patrick Doyle, realized that they needed to become a technology company. Because he saw, okay, like not only do I not want to lose to, Papa John's or Little Caesars or any of the other like pizza chains, he's like, I don't want to lose to delivery services, to DoorDash, to any of these services that were starting to pop up too. And so he said, we need to become a technology company. So the first thing he did is he went and recruited a leader, this guy, Kevin. And, talking to Kevin, it was interesting. He was like, at first I took the interview just like kind of as a favor. I know like there was no way I was going to work at a pizza company. And the CEO said, this is important. This is the future of our company. I want you to lead a transformation of our culture. And I want you to build the future of this company digitally. And like the seriousness and the interest and the genuine commitment to this that the CEO showed, even though he didn't know anything about code and wasn't a technologist, was what hooked Kevin on saying, what? Like, can I lead Domino's, this pizza company? Can I lead them to become a technology company? And the idea of like creating a big fish in a small pond environment for technical leaders and technical talent broadly is a really powerful one. Like, sure, anybody can go be engineer number 78,000 at Google, but can you be engineer number 2 at a brand that has been around for 50 years and help that company in digital transformation? Like, imagine the impact you can have in that kind of company. That's amazing. And so that was the starting point, showing the commitment from the top and saying, I'm going to empower you to lead this transformation. Another amazing story I share in the book, Barack Obama came to Silicon Valley to recruit the founding members of the US Digital Service. And this is an amazing story. I know because my co-founder, Evan, was one of the people that Obama recruited. And Evan had recently left Twilio. He was wondering what he was going to do next. He got an email from someone with a whitehouse.gov email address saying, hey, are you free to meet next week? And he's like, sure, I guess. And he shows up to a hotel. There's all this security. They're doing background clearance checks, all this kind of stuff. They escort him up to the top floor to the suite, and they're sitting there. Megan Smith is there. And suddenly they see a helicopter go by, Marine One. And they're like, is that? And 5 minutes later, Obama walks in the door. He basically says, our country needs you. We just passed the Obamacare Act, ACA, and this is hallmark legislation, so hard to pass legislation to provide healthcare for all. And my whole thing is going to fail because we can't build a friggin' website. Because if you remember, healthcare.gov was falling over. And that was like going to be the killer thing to this amazing hallmark legislation. And he says, we cannot let government, like technology, get in the way of actually governing this country. And I want you to come and serve your country. And so you think about these pitches that the leaders are making to this technical talent, saying, look at the impact you're going to have. Look at how important the work you're going to do is. And I'm going to trust you. So talk about sharing problems. Those are sharing big problems. The future of the company and Domino's, the future of our country in the case of Obama. Then, the next thing that I would say is, again, going back to sharing problems, not solutions. And the other story I share about Domino's is Patrick Doyle calls up the technical leader, Kevin, one day, and he says, we need to make it so that someone can order a pizza from a stoplight. Because parents who are on their way home from work and realizing that they have not figured out dinner tonight, if they could order it from a stoplight, from the amount of time you have sitting at a stoplight, then we can serve those customers and we can take a much bigger share of the wallet for dinner time. And he just shared that one simple problem. And that led the team down multiple years of innovation that led them to creating like ordering via text message, the whole mobile app strategy, Alexa, and being able to order with voice commands and things like that. And just automate, like creating all these new channels and ways to order your favorite pizza. It caused them to have to create a database of, okay, store my favorites because I don't have time to like configure the pizza every time. And so create a profile for me that makes it easy for me to reorder. And then that led them to the whole pizza tracker thing, which is like, where's the pizza? Am I going to get there before the pizza? And the whole pizza tracker thing, which is now like really famous. And so many other companies they call their things, even though it's like, UPS, they call it the pizza tracker because like Domino's made this famous. And so that one simple question, can you order a pizza from a stoplight? Because if we did that, I think we'd solve a huge problem for our customers, led to years of innovation. And so I've seen this work at so many companies, from that pitch of telling folks how important that their contributions are going to be to this company that isn't a technology company, to sharing problems and then unleashing the talent on that team. I think this can work at any company. Because if you think about what do most people want? They want to be empowered. They want autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And so when you think about taking great technical talent, we all know how hard it is to hire developers. And it's even more confounding when people complain, it's so hard to hire developers. And by the way, when they get here, I treat them like a factory worker and don't let them make decisions. You're like, well, you thought about that, right? How about knowing how hard it is to hire developers, get the best folks in the door by promising them that they will have autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Purpose, affect the future of this organization. Mastery, we're going to hire other great people and you're going to learn. You're going to be this like tiger force. And autonomy, I'm going to trust you. In a lot of ways, this whole ask your developer mindset came from one of my experiences starting a few of my earlier companies where I hired this guy named Matt Levinson, who I talk about in the book. He was my co-founder in several of these companies, and he was a total technophobe. He actually didn't know anything about technology. When I first hired him, this was like 1999, I gave him his laptop and he was like, well, I don't need that. And like, this is to set the stage for like how much not a technologist he was. And I don't know how that didn't come out in the interview process, by the way. But what we got into this working style where like he was an operator and I was the technologist. And he'd come to me and say, I'm trying to like, we were partners building the retail store. And he'd come to me one day and say, I'm trying to figure out how can I incentivize the store manager to convert shoppers into buyers. And so is there a way that you can figure out how to count how many people walk in the door? I was like, yeah, I think those people counters you see at the doors of stores that like have a light beam and you walk through it. And he's like, and could you compare that data to how many sales we made that day? And then therefore show them what their conversion rate is, just like you might on the website. I was like, interesting question. Now, let me go figure it out. And like, it got that bug in my mind. I wanted to go solve this problem, like figuring out how well we are at converting shoppers into buyers. And so I like ordered one of these like, people counting machines and like reverse engineered an API from it. And then like started pulling data out of our point of sale. And like 2 days later, I'm like, boom, there it is. There's a stat right on the dashboard so the manager can see it. And that idea of someone who's less technical, instead of pretending like they know the answers, coming to you with a business problem that then just gets the gears turning. Like that's what you want to do. And I think that can work in any company. In fact, it's even easier to do if you're not technical, as long as you have humility. Don't pretend like you know the answers, but just bring those big business problems.
It's kind of a big caveat there, though, at the end, because so many of us have been indoctrinated, especially those of us who've gone through business training and business schools, that to admit you don't know something is a kind of weakness. We're not exactly renowned for our humility. There's a great question before I move on, there's a great question that just came in from an audience member who wants to know if you believe that there is such a thing as a 10x developer. And can you make any developer a 10x developer?
Here's what I would say. I think there are certain developers who are able to combine two things really successfully. I think one is they know their domain, right? They know their programming language and they know their database, whatever, like their tool set they know really well. And that's a lot of developers can achieve that by just, spending time learning the craft. The second thing certain developers can do really well, and I think this is a little more of a special skill set, is they can imagine the entire system in their head. They can hold an entire system in their head, all the way from the customer and their problem and what they're trying to do, all the way through the details of like the Linux kernel of like what's going on when you try to make a database right. And they can kind of intuitively connect all the dots of how things work. And when you're able to hold that whole system in your head, you're able to be incredibly productive. And I think that is more rare. I think there's a certain kind of mindset that enables folks to be able to see that full picture end to end. But I will say this, there are certain things that we can do as leaders, as we build our companies, to encourage or discourage that kind of ability. By the way, I will say that the 10x developer also has a bad reputation in some ways because they tend to be heroes and people rely on them, and they are the ones who are like, they know it all, and like the whole team does nothing, and one person does everything, and everyone thinks that's let's shower that person with praise, when in fact that person's really holding back the team and probably holding back the company, and the bust factor around that person is very high. So I actually don't particularly cherish or reward this idea of like we should all seek to find the 10x developers, because it's not a scalable way to build a company.
You're much better off building 10x teams.
Yeah, you should build 10x teams, not 10x people. But the thing that I would say you can do to build that 10x team, or encourage some of that full system thinking that I think does increase productivity massively, is to instill full end-to-end ownership in those teams. So Twilio, we are built in small teams. So no team is bigger than 10 people. The definition of a team is a customer, a problem you're solving for that customer, and then metrics of progress to solve that problem. And what you want is to instill that team with ownership over that customer and that problem so that they can act autonomously. So they can, as a team and even many of the individuals, be close enough to the customer and to the problem they're solving that they can hold the whole thing in their head. And like, yes, you carve down the problems you're trying to solve for those customers. As the company grows, you kind of carve it down into something that is manageable by a team of, say, 10 people. But within the scope of what that team has, they should be able to conceptualize everything from the customer down to the details of the Linux kernel, what's going on, so that they can serve that customer. And if you've scoped it right, that team can own end to end. And by the way, I think those teams need to own not just building the product, but actually operating it.
And supporting it.
And supporting it. Like, we don't have a throw it over the wall to the operations team at Twilio. We have teams build and operate their own services, which is increasingly common with microservices. But I believe in the end of the day, what that really does is create a sense of ownership and an end-to-end understanding of what they're building that enables them to operate with greater efficiency. Because instead of having let's set up 10 meetings to go figure out if I change this form field, what are all the downstream things that need to change? If you're able to kind of contain the problem to something that one person and one team are able to conceptualize end to end, then they can move so much faster, because you say, oh yeah, if I change this, we have to go change that and that and that, and you can get it done in 5 minutes, as opposed to endless meetings to try to figure it out. And then, of course, how do you make sure that one team's changes don't infect everybody else? Well, that's where good APIs and service contracts between the teams are really important.
Yeah,
and so
I think this is the modern way of company building. And if this is a new idea to anyone listening, you should, and especially if you're watching the video after the fact, you should rewind and listen again to Jeff's answer to this. It was the most succinct explanation of this concept I think I've ever heard. But think about the definition of what makes a team, and think about the things that Jeff did not mention. He didn't mention programming language or skill set or geography or language. Only a customer, a metric. Oh, I just blew it.
A customer, a mission.
And a metric. I was like, I never trust myself to remember 3 things for even 10 seconds. Okay, good. Questions are from the audience are starting to come in, and I encourage everybody, please use the Q&A tab. To do it. Before we get too in the weeds with some of these questions, though, I want to get your bigger picture view on a few things, because we're kind of in an interesting moment. There's a lot of discussion now about the perils and promise of technology, about the impacts of software on our broader society. What advice do you have for people, who you think of them as technology citizens, either developers or customers or business leaders, for those who want to take a more active role in shaping a better future? What do you think is helpful?
Well, I take a little different point of view than maybe many in the technology industry or in Silicon Valley. I don't really have a libertarian mindset. The mindset that says, we just build things and how people use it is their responsibility. I do believe that we as creators have a responsibility for the things that we create. And it's our job. In some ways, it's like a contract with society. Companies exist because they make society stronger. There's no God-given natural law of the universe that says corporations should exist.
And should enjoy limited liability.
Yeah, words on a piece of paper mean that piece of paper can own property and enter into contracts and things like that. No, this is a human construct that we believe in because it's making society better. It enables wealth generation. It enables jobs and innovation and all sorts of things. So we believe that corporations, which by the way are a relatively new thing. I mean, they're only a few centuries old. We think that it is additive to society. However, that contract is not ironclad, right? We could wake up one day and say, you know what, society is worse off because of corporations. And you see that sentiment a little bit around technology, right? You see it around antitrust type things. And so when I think about the company we're building, and then I'll get to the technology, but the company we're building, I believe as a founder of a company, I want to build a company for which our communities around us and society at large are stronger because we existed. Because I believe that's fulfilling actually on what corporations exist to do, not just make a profit, because externalities, there's so many externalities that mean companies can make profits, but society suffers. And I think that if all the externalities of corporations were exposed, people would very much change their opinions about the role of corporations in society. So we have a job to make society and our communities stronger. Now, we don't have to, because the profit motive is technically what corporations are designed to do, but I want to do that. And that's why I started a company. So that's kind of how I think about it overall, the responsibility of corporations. Now we have a special role as technology companies. And this is even more important because the impact of technology on society is so profound, more profound than any other field that I would say has ever existed, especially in the private realm. And so if you think about technology started as like memory and CPUs and things like that, and you're like, okay, great. And it's hard to tell exactly how people are going to use them. You can use them for good, you can use them for bad. And I kind of understand we're just going to make CPUs and we're going to help the world with this computing machine. But now we compute, a lot of technology is social media and things that have the ability to reach billions of people and impact billions of people. And that is a tremendous response. That is a responsibility greater than even governments have. Governments have a responsibility for their population. Technology companies span almost every company in the world. And so there's a tremendous responsibility that we have to make society better because of the existence of our products. And I just think if you eschew that responsibility, A, I think society will catch up with you. And B, I think that you're just not doing your moral right in creating these technologies. And I disagree with this idea, we just create a platform and people can say or do whatever they want. I'm like, a lot of that's bullshit. It's just an excuse to not have to solve hard problems. And yes, they're hard problems. They're very hard problems. But guess what? Two things. One, in a lot of other realms of very hard problems, leaders roll up their sleeves and say, great, revenue, great, let's do this thing. Figure out ad networks. Okay, great. We're going to do this. And they tackle head on really hard problems. And that's why they have so many amazing people working at these companies. But the second thing is, there's no God-given right for your social media platform to exist. And it's not like you created this platform that can cause a lot of harm and you can just wipe your hands of it and say, well, that's just how people use it. No, if you created this and the net result of how people use it is so destructive to society, then society's job should be to tear it down. We should say this is not allowed to exist anymore because it is harming society. And so the arguments for antitrust are actually good arguments in terms of this is harming consumers.
I feel like we remiss.
We don't take our own responsibility for it.
Yeah, I feel like, given we're having this conversation, a day after, an armed insurrection breached the nation's capital, at the direction of our country's own leadership, a horrifying event yesterday. And I feel remiss talking about this, given that event was planned, mobilized, the people who did it were radicalized on social media and taking full advantage of technology platforms that were developed here in Silicon Valley. So I didn't want to just let it pass. So given what you're saying about the role of technology, I don't want to ask you kind of a political question or a policy question, but maybe just, I'm sure some of the people listening to us right now are employees who work at those companies or on affiliated technology. What advice would you have for technologists who find themselves bound up with these world historical events where, you raise the question of what is the morally right thing to do? I think we both also think that it's also in the long-term interests of a company and of an industry to do the morally right thing. So how would you counsel people who are caught up in those controversies today?
Well, I can certainly understand folks, wanting financial security for themselves and their families and therefore valuing the jobs they have. The thing I'll say is there's a lot of companies you can go work at. And typically, not everybody, but a lot of the people who work at these technology companies do have many other companies that would want to employ them at the same salary or even more. And so I think that the right way to think about it is to where you work, where you make your contributions to society and where you take your paycheck from are an indication of your values. Mm-hmm. If you're working at a company that you don't have conviction around, you are making society stronger in a way that fits your values, then I think it's your moral obligation to find a place where you are. That's how I think about it. And that's my assumption, by the way, about my employees, that, I'm going to build a company that has moral conviction and that employees who agree with the moral conviction that we have will love working at Twilio. And by the way, I'm aware that there are people who may not agree with those values and therefore may choose not to work at Twilio. And I'm fine with that too, right? If people think, oh, we're just a platform, we can't, free speech, blah, 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 blah. And those aren't the decisions that we make, then they can go work at a company where those are the values, and that's fine with me. So I just think that it sounds obvious and it sounds preachy, which is the weird thing, but it also is, I'm sort of astounded by how often people don't do that.
Totally.
I don't know if it's
very surprising.
I think it's, I think people probably feel like they can get jobs elsewhere. I don't think they really think like, oh, such and such company is the only place where I can ever work. Like chances are that company is great on your resume and you can work anywhere else. It's good for now on your resume. If they keep acting badly, maybe it won't be.
Think about if you were like a top exec at Philip Morris or something back in the day.
Yeah, right. Like who wants to work at Philip Morris? And once it becomes clear that that's what a company might be doing to society, I think it's your obligation. And by the way, in a self-interested way, I think it's good for folks to leave that, because you're like, yeah, when I realized the negative impact we were having on society, it's when I said, I don't want to do that. And, people get a free pass for when it was less clear, maybe 5-10 years ago, but now that it's pretty obvious, I think that it could become a mark on one's resume. Anyway,
I want to ask you one other civic question, and then I'm going to start we'll bounce around because the audience questions have been pouring in and people have lots of things they want to know about. But I was really struck by something that you wrote. Speaking of the positive uses of social media, you wrote on Twitter and LinkedIn, and I was tempted to actually read the whole thing, but it's a little bit lengthy, so maybe I won't read it, but simply saying that you took objection to some of our wealthy friends and colleagues who have been relocating their companies out of the Bay Area and out of California during the pandemic, and kind of doing so in a very loud and in-your-face way that even like posting manifestos on their way out of what California and San Francisco should be doing to reform themselves. Just give you a chance to talk a little bit about that and why you think it's important to commit to the Bay.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I think my biggest point in a lot of ways is, look, we're in the middle of a generational pandemic. So much of the world is struggling tremendously. And as a technology industry, generally speaking, we've fared fairly well because of our workforces. Our largely knowledge workforces are able to work from home successfully. Our products tend to be relevant to this time. And so technology as an industry largely has thrived during this pandemic when so much of society has not. And so when I think about that moment where our communities around us are struggling so much, but we are succeeding, what's the right thing to do? Is it pick up and go and complain about all the problems? Or is it to actually count our blessings and use those blessings to try to make our communities better? And that's how I look at it, right? And it's like, do I fault people for leaving the Bay Area because like the Bay Area is imperfect? Sure. There's a lot of problems. California has a lot of problems. San Francisco has a lot of problems. The Bay Area, like there's no shortage of problems. So I'm not arguing that like these aren't problems. But what I would say is, number one, like now isn't the time to bail. Now is the time to roll up our sleeves and commit to our communities. And number two, I would also ask, given all the problems that California or San Francisco or whoever faces, like it's time to engage. Get involved civically, get involved politically, and get involved philanthropically if you have the means, because that's the way in which we make our cities and our communities better, is by caring. And I think people that are just like writing blog posts on their way out, as opposed to actually rolling up their sleeves and becoming engaged civically, I think one way is the way it works, and one way is more cowardly.
All right, let me jump around a little bit because these questions, have come in about all the different topics that you've been talking about. Let's start with this one. The question is: Jeff mentioned the importance of communications. What other areas are software developers often blind to? We don't have 2 hours, so you're gonna have to pick some top ones, and need other people to support. And they also want a bonus question of what are the downsides to Agile and continuous deployment. I see it's a double combo question.
So in my first draft of this book, which we all are not going to get the displeasure of reading, I wrote a chapter that was like scathing about Agile. I was like, Agile is horrible. I can't remember the name of the chapter, but it was like, actually, I do remember. I remember the working title of that chapter. It was F Agile. And I gave it to some folks at Twilio, actually, some of our engineering managers who I knew actually were good at implementing Agile. And I said, "Curious to hear what you think of this." And they were like, "You're an idiot, Jeff." Because the volumes of things that you don't truly understand about Agile are apparent. I was like, okay, great. So educate me. And after a lot of working with those leaders, like what I came to realize, the thing that Agile brings a lot of good things to the world, and certainly is better than waterfall, no doubt. And so a lot of great things have come about because of Agile. But what I realized, the thing that I don't like about Agile is the strict division of roles that it tends to propagate. It tends to say there's the product owner role, like there's the engineer role, there's the scrum master role, blah, blah, blah. And then the way you implement your roles is like with Kanban, where you've got the like, okay, the product owner writes the stories, which are basically tasks, and puts them on a board. And an engineer walks up to a board and grabs a task and does a task and puts it on the other side of the board. I'm like, that is the robotic factory worker, passionless world that I just don't like, that I don't believe in. Because that is enforcing that idea that product owner knows, telling us what we should build, and the engineer's job is to pull like a random ticket off the wall. Like, I don't care what this thing says, whatever it says, I'm going to write it. Click, click, click. Like, that's the thing that I think is a little ridiculous, because that is literally sharing a solution, not a problem. And so that's the part of Agile that I really don't like, and I think a pitfall. So, you know, one of the ways I test this, actually, because we let every team inside of Twilio, every engineering team, really decide how they work. We don't dictate it's got to be this way or that way. They all decide, and some of them use different forms of Agile. Obviously, we all know there's not one form of Agile, but there's many ways to interpret the manifesto. And so a lot of the different teams interpret it differently. And a lot of engineering leaders, for example, bring whatever they used at their last company in. And one of the things that I do is I walk around to the company and I talk to teams, or, you know, back when I could walk around the company, and I'd ask the developer, yeah, what are you working on? And they'd say, oh yeah. And they'd show me what they're working on. And I'd say, great. Like, what customer problem is that solving? And then sometimes they would say, oh, well, you know, the customers need to do X, Y, and Z, and they haven't been able to do it, or it was frustrating before. And so blah, blah, blah. I'm like, oh, okay, fantastic. Great job. And then other times the engineer would say, oh, I don't know. The product manager just gave me the task. And I'd be like, oh, interesting. And like, I make a mental note, like I should go talk to that engineering manager just to find out why, you know, they've got a bunch of folks working on their team who have no idea why they're building the things they're building, because that's fundamentally against my ethos of like bringing people along for why they're there, what problem they're solving, and sharing problems, not solutions. So I think Agile has the ability to encourage that solution sharing.
Management by walking around is part of the HP way from way back. And maybe to put Agile in its proper historical context, I think people forget this. Like waterfall development, the concept of waterfall was coined in the 60s, actually, as a way of criticizing already that style of development. But the more formal kind of advocacy for what we now call waterfall is really more properly understood as stage gate development. That was really first articulated in the 1980s. So Agile was a major breakthrough and advance intellectually over those earlier theories. But the Agile Manifesto, we're actually just about to pass the 20th anniversary, I just realized, of the Agile Manifesto. It was February 11th, 2001. So that's only in a couple of weeks. So it's already 20 years old. And, you know, it's been a busy 2 decades. A few things have happened since then. And we've learned a few things. And you know, if you look at the Agile Manifesto, it says right there, that the unit of progress is a line of working code, which again, way better than it being a specification document, but certainly inferior to what Jeff has been talking about, that we can define progress now in terms of outcomes and metrics, and that kind of passing information across functional boundaries, which was so critical to Agile. We've outgrown that now. We're actually able to work in small teams in a much more collaborative way. So that's
yeah, I totally agree. By
not
the way,
like it was just yesterday.
If you buy the book, you get a free copy of the Agile Manifesto.
It's right there.
Added bonus. It's actually Creative Commons licensed, so anybody can obviously use that. But with attribution, of course. The other thing, the first part of that question, by the way, though, is what do developers need help with? Which I thought was an interesting question. You know, how I'll answer it is this. I think developers sometimes discount their own ability to understand customers. And then I think a lot of companies build up structures that actually are designed to shield developers from customers. So if you think about it, like in the early days of Twilio, when we were like 3 people, like we all did every job, and like I did customer support, and then I wrote a bunch of code, and I used our product all the time. And so you kind of keep the full picture in your head. But as the company grows, you staff a customer support team, and their job is to handle all the tickets and like not have engineers have to look at those tickets. And you a sales team to go out and like work with the customers, a sales engineering team to answer the technical questions in those sales processes, and product managers. They're out to go interview customers and do all the work. And so all these things are designed in many ways to build walls to shield developers from customers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a mistake. Now, look, I think you should have all those functions. Don't get me wrong. You want to have a customer support team. You want to have product managers. All that stuff's great. But you need to poke holes through those walls for developers to be able to actually interact with customers. And I think the job of a product manager is not to shield developers from customers, but rather to facilitate the interactions, the helpful interactions between the team and customers, so the team builds an intrinsic understanding of what they need to do for that customer. And there's a neat story in the book that I told from Ben, one of the product managers at Twilio, told the story. He was a developer, and straight out of college, he got a job at Bloomberg, writing one of those widgets on the Bloomberg terminal. His team owned one of those widgets, and he, in his first week on the job or whatever, he asked his manager, he's like, so when are we going to go to a trading floor and like talk to some of our customers? And the engineering manager basically laughed at him, was like, oh, we've never done that before. And Ben, being this like bushy-tailed, bright-eyed, just out of college developer, was like, oh, I would have figured that we did that a lot. Okay. And then, so Ben sort of like just found his own way. He like knew a friend of a friend who was a trading. He's like, do you mind if I come by and just like see how our software is used? And the person's like, sure. So he goes to the trading floor of one of the banks, and he sees how his software is being used on this terminal. And the interesting thing, he's like, he looks at the screen, and he's like, where's my widget? And
where's my widget?
Right there. It's like this one tiny little square. It's like, 16 pixels by 16 pixels among like 1,000 widgets on the screen. And people's like, oh, when we build this software, we always assume that it's like the full screen, like that our widget is the center of the universe. And it's like the whole screen. And he's like, this is totally illegible. Like you can't even make out any of the text or the chart. And so he went back and was like, that informed a whole lot of decisions about like using different fonts and like scaling the charts differently, because seeing how a customer actually used their software was totally different from how he imagined they did it and everything that they were building. And so I always love that story, because it's a story of getting out, meeting customers in a way that's helpful. And you think about the product management job to like facilitate those interactions with customers as opposed to shield from it.
Okay, here's a great one. How receptive were investors to Twilio's original pitch?
Not at all.
This person has inferred that, given that traditional telecom must have seemed dead at that time, how were you able to convey your vision / the opportunity? And now that Twilio is such a successful company, I'm sure we've all retconned an assumption that people thought this was a great idea when you first started it, but I recall something a little bit different. So just talk a little bit about what that was like.
Well, if you remember the stat at the beginning when the introduction, $0 raised, my first attempt to raise money for Twilio. So I pitched the idea for Twilio. To give you the really quick history, I talked to a lot of customers first and pitched developers the idea. And they all basically said, oh yeah, I'd have a lot of use cases for it. Yeah, let me know when that's ready. And so I got a lot of conviction around this is going to work. Started building it, built a prototype, got developers starting to use it, then went out to raise money. And I said, okay, great. We're going to raise a bunch of money. We'll close our financing this summer. This is the summer of 2008. We'll close our financing, and then we'll do a big launch, and everything will be amazing. So go out to raise money, summer of 2008. Two things happened. Number one, it's the summer of 2008. Financial crisis is in full swing. Like investors are just like closed for business, basically. So that sucked. But more than that, there were a lot of them who weren't, and a lot of them who were still investing. And when I talked to them, and they'd say, "Oh, this is really, I think I understand, but like." Is API, is the whole product, that doesn't make any sense. So what you got to do is you got to go build an app for developers, build a PBX or something like the company phone system. And, if that's successful, you can add an API to it later. That's what Facebook did. It seems to be working well for them. So you got to build an app first, because there's no such thing as like an API that is the product. And I got this really consistent refrain from investors, and went the whole summer.
They all read the same book.
Yeah, basically no one had seen it before. And so pattern matching, yada, yada, and went the whole summer, didn't raise a dime. Meanwhile, we'd kept building the product, and we'd kept having those like early like alpha customers use it, give us feedback and iterate. And it was the end of the summer. It was like, August, September. And I remember we got our like last no from the last investor, like the last one we'd hold out hope. Oh, I think they might do it. And they were like, sorry. And I had a call with my co-founders. I remember relaying the bad news to them. Like we have zero. We didn't even have a bank account because we didn't have a cent to put in.
No need for a bank account.
No need for a bank account. We don't have any money, right? So we didn't even have a bank account. And we honestly said, like, maybe this is just a really bad idea. No, these investors are smart people, and none of them believe, and maybe this is a stupid idea.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we had all these customers who were building and using Twilio, and were telling us we're on the right path. And so what we decided was, look, we can listen to investors or we can listen to customers. We're going to listen to customers. So we kept building. We launched in November of 2008, and immediately developers started signing up, started putting in their credit card, started paying us, started launching stuff with us. And like our first month, I think we made $1,000. The second month was like $4,000. The next month was like $8,000. I don't remember the exact numbers. And then I went back to those investors after like 3 months and I showed, here's our traction so far. And even though it was like super early, the idea that customers were validating it with their money, that was the proof they needed to say, oh, you know what? All right, I'll make a bet. And we'd raise a seed round at that point.
You ever have the experience? I remember showing investors once a hockey stick shaped growth curve, and they'd be like, wow, this growth curve is awesome. What are the units in this graph? Is this in thousands or tens of thousands? And being like, no, sir, these are in ones. This is the actual, showing you the actuals. And that's a good shape though, right?
And it was like just showing the actual customer traction was what was really needed. The other advice I give to entrepreneurs all the time is, tell people what you're going to do and then do it. Right. And like, that's the best way to fulfill on like an investor or a customer, or whoever it is. And so, I remember one investor, Mitch Kapoor, I went and pitched in that first round and he said, no. Mitch is an amazing person. Mitch Kapoor is, I think he's probably got a big presence at the Computer History Museum. He invented the spreadsheet basically, or popularized it at least. And he said, I'm not going to invest because I don't think you figured out this developer go-to-market. And it was probably true, right? Like we just sort of had a, like, if you build it, they will come mentality. And so he said, I'm not going to invest. And I said, and I never let an investor tell you no without getting an asking them what it would take to turn that into a yes.
What would it take?
What would it take? And I said, well, what would it take to get you to yes? He said, well, I really think you need some sort of consultant, some sort of person to come in and help you figure out this go-to-market. And I said, who would you recommend? He thought about it for a second. He said, I think probably Dave McClure. And so I said, okay, can you make an introduction? I didn't tell him that I'd been introduced to Dave about 5 times prior and Dave never responded to the introductions. But I said, oh, would you mind introducing me to this person? And so finally I got Dave's attention, got a meeting with him, pitched him on the idea. Dave was like, that's really cool. Brought him on board as a consultant. And then I went back to Mitch several months later and I said, hey, Mitch, remember last time we talked and you said, I should get, someone who understands go-to-market. You said I should get Dave McClure. And I was like, ta-da. And I'm like, here's Dave. I brought him to the meeting with me. And then that coupled with the growth curve that even though it was a few months old was really going in the right direction. He was like, all right, great. Where do I sign? And so this idea that like,
that conviction is actually so rare among investors. And of course, Mitch is renowned for that, but we're really willing to say like, if I see X, Y, Z, then I'm like prepared to make the bet. That's a great story. I mean, it worked out pretty well for Dave and for Mitch, I would think.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. There was another question I wanted to, first of all, one person just wanted to know real quick, did you charge customers from the beginning and how did you get your early customers?
Yeah, great question. The very earliest customers, before we started Twilio, I went around and talked to developers that I knew. And I just said, hey, I have this way of like validating really quickly ideas with potential customers, whatever the idea is. You go around to people who you think would be the customer of your idea. And you say, hey, I've got an idea I want to bounce off of you. And you say, hey, imagine a product that did A, B, and C. Would you be interested in signing up for that? And one of two things happen. Either they say, oh yeah, and you go to like friends, family, like people oh, that's really, so did you see the Giants game yesterday? And they like awkwardly change the topic on you because they don't want to say, and you're like, okay, noted, right? And then other times they ask you a lot of questions like, oh, what could it do? Would it do this? Would it do that? Blah, blah, blah. And what you see them is trying to pattern match the thing you just said to a problem that they have. And if they ask you questions, they're trying to match the two things together. Like that's a good sign. And so when I pitched folks on Twilio, developers, I explained, imagine it was an API and you called the API and it made the phone ring and you could have all these things happen. Would you have use cases for it? And a funny thing happened. At first they would say, oh, yeah, did you see that Giants game yesterday? Oh, okay, well, I guess it's a bad idea. But then about 30 seconds later, every single time it would be like, hey, wait, I have a question. Going back to that telephone thing you were telling me about, could I notify people when the package ships from the e-commerce site that I just built? I was like, yes, you could. And I saw the gears just start turning. And every time I had the same experience after having that a bunch of times, I was like, okay, there's something here. Like there's all these latent use cases that just aren't getting built because developers assume this isn't something they can do. And that's what gave us the conviction. Now, when we actually built the thing, I called back up all those people and said, hey, remember that idea I told you about, 5 months ago? Well, I've got the first version of the API, and I'd love for you to kick the tires and give me some feedback. And we did not charge. I just gave them access to the, and they gave us a lot of feedback. And they started building stuff. And we built based on their feedback and a lot of new things. And then when we launched, that's when we put a price tag on it. And we had a price tag on it from day one. So we never did the it's free and we'll make money later. But when we launched publicly, it had a price tag on it on day one.
All right, this is a great question. It's specified that it's for Eric and or Jeff, but I'm gonna let you handle it. Question is, how does privilege intersect with the risk-taking mindset that you've discussed?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a tremendous amount of privilege in taking these kinds of risks. And I recognize that is not something that everybody or even most people have available to them. The one thing that let me try to think about the best way to address that. I don't feel in many ways qualified to give that advice because, I did have a good degree of privilege. I did grow up with a computer and supportive parents. And as an entrepreneur, I always knew that if I failed, I wouldn't be living on the street because my parents would be able to lend me money or whatever. And so there's a tremendous amount of privilege that has allowed me to be an entrepreneur. But what I would say is what I would go back to is a lot of support for the organizations who are trying to give those opportunities to folks who might not otherwise have it. And that's why I think the work that many organizations are doing in this realm to help people to connect with opportunities is so important. So, for example, the proceeds from the Ask Your Developer book are going to 4 organizations who are helping people enter the field of technology from underrepresented backgrounds. And so, I think this is a really important cause to try to create the conditions of opportunity for more and more people in our society. So those organizations are like NPower, who helps veterans get trained to enter the technology field, Year Up, which helps young adults enter the technology field, SMASH, which is a program founded by the Kapors, Mitch and Frida Kapor, which helps high school students from underrepresented backgrounds enter the fields in STEM, and Black Girls Code. And so while I can't say that everybody has the same opportunities to take those kinds of risks, I do really think the work that a lot of organizations are undertaking to try to provide those opportunities, that's why their work is so critical.
I'm really glad to hear you say that. I think in the future, this is going to be seen as a moral obligation, but also as a policy imperative that this kind of opportunity be universally available.
Yep.
To every citizen. It's otherwise it's a just absolutely criminally negligent waste of human potential.
So Eric, do we have to do our word?
Yeah, I was just going to say we got one last question, and I'm going to read it right here. So as part of CHM's One Word initiative, you were asked to write down one word of advice for a young person starting out in their career. Can you share your one word and the story behind why you chose it?
I can. I can't tell if it's backwards or not. Is it forwards?
We see it. That's a good choice.
Conviction. The reason why I say that is as an entrepreneur or a builder of really most varieties, you put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into the things you build, whether it's a company or whether it's a product. And I've always found that when you don't have the conviction, when you don't have this visceral feeling in your gut that the world needs the thing that you're building, it's really hard to get through all the difficulties that are inherent in building something. Because building things is hard. You will have setbacks. And so developing that conviction. And my story is I founded 4 companies. My first company, I was a college student. I founded a website for college students. My second company was StubHub, online exchange for live event tickets, which I thought was an interesting business opportunity. But I didn't go to a lot of concerts. I didn't go to a lot of sporting events. I just wasn't the customer of this thing. To me, it was just e-commerce of another thing. And I didn't have conviction. I was I don't really care if the world gets this thing. It's fine. It's a good way to make money. But it wasn't the kind of conviction that made me want to really work as hard as I could. And so that's why I decided to move on. Then after a strange series of events, I ended up starting a bricks and mortar retailer for extreme sporting goods. And again, I found I had made the same mistake again. I did not actually care if the world had another skateboard, because it was a fine business, large market, growing fast, yada, yada, good business opportunity. But it wasn't something that I viscerally cared about. And I felt in my gut that the world was better when we sold another skateboard. And I'm not judging, like it's fine for those businesses to exist, but it wasn't a thing that really wanted me to get out of bed in the morning and do the best work that I could. And so that's when I decided, that I would move on. And in founding Twilio, I found a company and a product and a domain and a customer that I loved, that I loved serving. I love serving developers. I love helping companies engage better with their customers because that creates stronger companies and stronger bonds between companies and their customers. I just love what Twilio does. And now here I am 13 years into building Twilio, and I still enjoy every day. And so to me, conviction is the word I would give to, like, fine, it's hard to find. You may make some mistakes like I did, and that's fine. But to really give your full self and be able to persist through all the challenges you have in building something, conviction is a really important starting point.
Well, it's always a pleasure to do this, and I'm going to hand it back over to Daniel to close. But thanks to CHM and to Jeff for the opportunity. This was really fun.
Thank you, Eric. And thank you, Daniel.
You bet, Eric, Jeff. What a terrific program from my vantage point. At CHM, we're focused on the fact that life as we know it doesn't exist without computing. And in fact, as we all know, people were the original computers, and then they invented computers. And Jeff and Eric, the conversation and your enthusiasm and personal energy and insights that you bring forward with this type of a conversation are absolutely illustrative of the purpose and mission at CHM, which is to decode technology, the computing past, digital present, and then the future impact to shape a better future for people. And I think this conversation demonstrates that understanding people is key, their enthusiasm and energy is key. And if you found this program interesting, I'm going to encourage you to go to our website, computerhistory.org, and go to the Join and Give button, because we need your support to maintain and keep this program going. So thank you all so much, Eric, Jeff, and all of our attendees today. We appreciate your support. Thanks so much, and have a good day. Bye-bye.